welcome to the show. Very nice to have your company. Japan Post's proposed acquisition of Toll edging ahead as of this week. The green light from the Foreign Investment Review Board. Some say a mere formality, but still the symbolism all too apparent. Now set to go the way of the Japanese behemoth, and certainly a chapter in Australian history, corporate history, is rewritten. This could pave the way for more buyouts, though, from Japan. It's got to be said. Aussie assets still attractive to investors. What, though, of the unions and their view on all of this? Certainly that march ever perhaps speedier from offshore. We're going to get to grips with that with you, with our special guest at least today. Joining us now, Michael Kaine, National Assistant Secretary, the Transport Workers Union of Australia. Great to have you with us, Michael, on the show. It's been one of those pretty surprising marriages where, for once, the union was on board seemingly from start to finish. Is that really how it's been playing out behind the scenes? How, I suppose, how problem-free really was it when you reflect?
Well, this is a company that's grown by acquisition since 1983, essentially, Toll in Australia. And the workforce and the company, in this instance, have really grown together in terms of how to deal with acquisitions. Of course, we're dealing with a very different type of acquisition now. Very much so, though, over those 30 years, workers and the company have worked on structures, not without agitation at times, but have worked on structures at a local level, a regional level, state level and a national level that have enabled them to deal with acquisitions within Australia over that 30 years. So the notion of an acquisition, something that this workforce is very used to, that doesn't mean that they're not very nervous though. This is a massive takeover.
Whose assets are described to be, almost twice the size of the Australian economy, and for those reasons there is some nervousness. But this is probably one of those situations where we may have workers, shareholders, and company all coming out potentially winners.
Yes, Michael, you mentioned it is rare, which is, I mean, that's perfectly, it stands out to me. Here you have a major foreign company coming into a major Australian company, and FIRB, well, yesterday would indicate, my understanding is that there was no opposition or submissions anywhere, from the union movement to FIRB, and it's the obvious contrast is with Qantas. When the private equity tried to take over Qantas, and there was, well, not least the union movement, that was a battle, ended up in a political battle through the FIRB process.
Yes, but there's obviously a contrast there, and it really does. Well, obviously, as a union official, I'm qualified to say this, that it really does make a difference about the approach that a company takes to its workforce. And of course, it's a strong workforce in Toll, and it's a workforce that from time to time agitates matters with the company. But there's a mature approach there, and it's built on the fact that Toll itself and the workers' demands put a real premium on full-time work as opposed to part-time positions, minimising the amount of casual workers that are in the workforce. All of this making them a very productive company. Indeed, Japan Post has said expressly that it wants Toll for its management structures, and part of the structures that are in Toll are the way that the workforce and management deal with these types of situations. So there's good reason for optimism. There's also some areas that we need to be really cautious about as well.
And what's Japan Post's record with its industrial relations? Does that give you grounds for confidence?
Well, that's a question that we're all still getting our heads around. It's a massive company. It's got operations that we know are essentially in three arms: finance, insurance, and logistics. And we're working with international unions, Japanese unions as well at the moment, to satisfy ourselves about those issues. What we want to see is a fulfilment of what Japan Post says it wants to see, which is Toll to move out its model into Asia, And of course we say part of that model is the productive arrangements that it has with its workforce. We say that wherever Toll goes on behalf of Japan Post, so too should go that model that's been so successful over time.
To that end, would you like to see, as it were, Japan Post put down some kind of marker in this market by way of a listing? It was actually to the CEO when the announcement was made. He didn't rule it out, as if to say, well, that's kind of a clear and visible illustration of a commitment to this market. If you do mean what you say, go the next step and actually have a listing. I mean, would that, to your mind, be on your checklist, on your watch list?
Certainly in the bunch of considerations. For us, what we're seeking at the moment, we're speaking with Toll and we're seeking meetings with Japan Post about these issues, is a clear commitment about what is the model that they want and that they aspire to in Toll. Now, everything that's been set up to this point leads us to a position of optimism. But you know, Toll's not without its problems. It's had some problems in North America. It's tried to expand, particularly in the port areas, and there's been some concerns of workers about some union busting arrangements in New Jersey, and those type of matters are on the workforce's mind. But as a general proposition, we'd like to see Japan Post really confirm that if it says it wants Toll for all of the success that it's brought and can bring, then that means bringing with it the engagement model that's been built up in Australia with employees.
Yes. If I can move a bit more generally to a broader proposition, what would the union attitude, or your union's attitude, to M&A be in general? I mean, do you see it as a positive development? If one could look at it in a trend, as a long-term trend?
Well, our approach in general is that you get the best benefits if you deal with it in a mature fashion. Some companies won't allow you to do that because of the way that the philosophy that they bring to their workforce relations. And you mentioned Qantas before. That was a real concern for us and remains a concern. You've got incredibly high levels of part-time work and casualisation. You've got workers on part-time arrangements that effectively mean that they're below the minimum wage. When you have that type of approach, that type of cutthroat, cost-cutting approach in your operation, then you want to talk about mergers and acquisitions, then of course it's a very different recipe than you have at Toll.
Does that, when you try to get your message across, I'm just thinking in terms of the future relationship with Japan Post, if it is the case that you are saddled with this, say, inside Qantas, as you pointed out, that shift in working arrangements to a far less full-time kind of backdrop, does that make it harder, presumably, to kind of state your case with authority to Japan Post on minimum work standards into the future, if they can look and see that you have capitulated, as it were, in another notable instance? How do you reconcile those two?
No, it's not. I don't think it's a capitulation,
okay.
But it is a very good question. I think the answer is this: that we now have a succession of reports at government and academic level that show that the productiveness of a workforce is in complete relationship with the certainty that those workers have about their jobs. Efficiency is tied to certainty. Businesses crave certainty, workers crave certainty. In those circumstances, if you take Toll as an example, you have a workforce where the direct hire employees and owner drivers, there are drivers that are engaged by Toll that own their own vehicles, they're small businesses. When they have a level of certainty, then what has been shown is that the productive capacity of the company rises. And in Toll, take an example in Toll, the workforce has worked together with Toll over the last 5 years to consolidate some 108 separate workplace agreements into one. That's an incredible efficiency that can be gained. What
we haven't ticked off, and time is really against us, but I'm just curious to know, at what point were you brought into the big tent on this one? When were you consulted? Was it kind of after the signing ceremony, to be kind of, blunt about? matters, or was it a very early stage? Because this was a very notable deal for its confidentiality, right, Simon? No one kind of breathed a word of it, which is highly unusual. From your perspective, could you have been consulted earlier? Are you happy with that time frame on reflection?
Look, there are commercial confidentiality considerations that you know, we're cognizant of. We were not told about this until the deal was done. Could it have been an earlier discussion with us? I think it could have been. I think we could have given some undertakings, but may well have been useful for us to be consulted earlier, but that's as it was.
You get the last word.
Yeah, I mean, it always strikes me that in deals that potentially could be controversial, it should always be good to have a union endorsement, you know, if possible, obviously, or not endorsement, but you know, but some sort of collaboration, you know, alongside those other diligences that are done.
Well, obviously, if you have a workforce, and the workforce is the union, of course, if you have a workforce that's that has the capacity to look mid-term and long-term down the tube, then that's a good thing for the company, it's a good thing for workers. We just have to be very cautious that what's been said in these public pronouncements from Japan Post and Toll, it'll be able to hold those to account and make sure that these structures find their way throughout the rest of the economies.
Michael, we will leave it there. I really appreciate your insights. Thanks indeed for joining the program this week.